On this day, the 28th of May 1948, well today not quite the 28th of May, today is the 26th of May, but on the 28th of May, the reunified National Party took power from Jan Smuts's United Party by 5 seats. The HNNP came to power in coalition with the Afrikaner Party. Dr. D.F. Malan became Prime Minister and formed the first government dominated by Afrikaners. Immediately after the 1948 election, the government began removing the remaining symbols of the historic British ascendancy and began institutionalizing their policies of segregation. Malan believed that Africans threatened the prosperity and purity of the Afrikaner culture, and that became known as the birth of apartheid. Well, to discuss these historic events that changed the course of our country, we are now joined in studio by Professor Nieftagodien, who is Noor Nieftagodien, who heads up the history workshop at Wits University. Thank you for coming in, Professor. Good to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, when Malan became Prime Minister of this country in 1948, how did he go about changing South Africa?
I think that it's important to remember that, first of all, they had a very slim majority. And there was no guarantee that 5 years later that they would remain in power. What was significant about the Malan regime and the first 5 years of apartheid is they acted quickly and decisively. In the space of 3 or 4 years, they promulgated a series of acts: the prohibition of mixed marriages, the Group Areas Act, the Population Registration Act. And there were perhaps two purposes behind those different pieces of legislation. The first one was obviously, as the name apartheid suggests, to implement very strict segregation. And secondly, to, in a sense, protect Afrikaners and to elevate Afrikaners to become the dominant language group, cultural group, and political group in the country. Yeah. So what one sees is that, contrary to the Smuts regime, which in the 1940s was criticized for being a bit uncertain and dithering somewhat on the issue of segregation. Under the apartheid regime, they acted decisively. And that was perhaps one of the key features of the Malan regime.
Yeah. What do you think made the apartheid government unshaken about their segregation laws, despite sanctions being posed on them by the entire world?
So I think that's perhaps the critical question, because often people focus on D.F. Malan. He was 74 years old when he came to power. He was quite conservative and was probably influenced by kind of neo-fascist ideas. He was dedicated to Afrikaner supremacy. But really the key issues that we need to keep in mind is that in the 1940s, or perhaps from the beginning of the Second World War, South Africa was fundamentally changed. There was massive urbanization. The urban areas, particularly around the PWV, were completely transformed. South Africa's urban areas became overwhelmingly black and in particular African. In the inner city, there was considerable mixing in the locations like Sophia Town, District 6, etc., across the country.
Yeah.
The Afrikaners, but not only the Afrikaners, big bosses, capital and the state, feared what this meant, because not only did you have the urban areas which were deemed to be white areas, now being overwhelmingly black. Areas had become mixed, and very importantly, what had happened was that the black population in these areas were becoming contentious, involved in all sorts of political struggles. This is what apartheid tried to stop through, in their view, segregating, first of all, blacks from whites, but also blacks internally.
Yeah, just very quickly, let's end this off. I need to understand this. I need to get my mind around this. Some of the policies that Malan was talking about believed, and I quote here, that Africans threatened the prosperity and purity of the Afrikaner culture. What made him think like this? What triggered this off in him?
I think there are various ways of thinking about it, but perhaps the most pertinent way is to think about the problem of the poor whites. Because this preoccupied, the Afrikaners. And in the inner cities, poor whites often lived, close to black people. And for the intellectuals, the Afrikaner intellectuals, the idea that the poor white could be associated could live with poor blacks, for them that was a problem. The intellectuals lived elsewhere. They lived in Auckland Park, right? But the poor whites lived close to what is today Fitas, right, or the inner cities. That is what they were concerned about. So when they spoke about threat to purity, they were particularly concerned about the supposed threat to poor whites.
All right, let's leave it there, Professor. Very interesting conversation, and looking back at those photographs doesn't bring back too many good memories. I have to be honest with you. Just not a nice South Africa. This South Africa, on the other hand, we've come a far way. If people argue we haven't come a far way, look at those photos and then talk to me again. Thank you for joining us.
That's
Thank
a
you for
pleasure.
talking to us on the program. All right, quickly, let's take a break. We're going to